In our last lesson, we looked at Lexington and Concord. Now, that battle ended on the morning of April 20th, with Boston surrounded by 15,000 Minutemen. General Gage immediately withdrew his forces back into Boston, and he realized he was surrounded, but it was effectively a stalemate. The 15,000 Minutemen couldn't invade Boston, and he had too few of men to push them away. Plus, he could be supplied by sea. The Boston harbor was still controlled by the British. In Boston, food had started to become extremely expensive. And in fact, as the winter began to arrive, minor skirmishes erupted as British regulars tried to pilfer food from islands in Boston harbor. In an attempt to end the rebellion, Gage offered a pardon to all patriots except John Hancock and Samuel Adams. We'll pay attention to this. This was the first peace overture, but it wouldn't be the last. His offer to pardon everyone actually angered the American forces even further, and even more Minutemen showed up. Now, throughout May of 1775, the British had continued to receive reinforcements by sea, most of them coming from Nova Scotia and other parts of Canada. Gage decided to break the siege on Boston. His intention was to attack Bunker Hill to the north and Dorchester Heights to the south. And so, on June 17th, the Battle of Bunker Hill commenced. Gage sent his officers and infantry across the Charles River, and they attacked Bunker Hill. 3 waves went up the hill. The first 2 were repulsed handedly. The third wave finally broke the American forces, and the Americans retreated. This was what was called a Pyrrhic victory. Yes, Britain had won, but the victory had cost them so much it was as if they had lost. A general in the British Army commented, "A few more such victories would have shortly put an end to British dominion in America." It was the costliest battle for Britain in the entire war. And thus the stalemate continued. The British controlled Boston and now also the Charleston Neck, but they were still surrounded by an enormous Minutemen army. 2 things happened in May as well that deserve our attention. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress authorized Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen to seize Fort Ticonderoga in New York. The Green Mountain Boys, an Appalachian militia band, captured the fort in a surprise attack, and there they discovered hundreds of cannons. Also in May, the Second Continental Congress formed. Now, you'll recall that the First Continental Congress had said, if this matter doesn't clear up, we're going to meet again in a year. And now, a year later, the matter had only become more dire. As the Second Continental Congress formed, all 13 colonies eventually arrived, and they also sent an invitation to Canada and the Caribbean islands again. But just the 13 colonies were there. They decided immediately they needed to take command of the army that had assembled outside Boston. So all the men outside of Boston became members of the Continental Army. They also needed a commander-in-chief. George Washington was unanimously elected, and he agreed to serve without compensation. The units around Boston intended to liberate the city. Meanwhile, the units in New York began a march on Canada. Now, the people who were in the Minutemen Army around Boston did not necessarily intend to join the Continental Army. These were militiamen who had shown up because of Lexington and Concord, and now were standing outside of Boston, not really sure how to proceed. As more and more militia units came from surrounding colonies, it became unclear who was in charge. Different officers would arrive, and different people had allegiance to different officers. When they had been told that they were all put into the Continental Army for the remainder of the year, and that George Washington was put in command, all of a sudden it became clear what the leadership structure was. But that doesn't mean that they enjoyed their position. The army at that time was very poorly equipped. Some men even had only spears as weapons. Further, a lot of these men, these militia fighters, were actually farmers, and by the time the winter would end, they would need to go back to their homes. It was unlikely that Boston would be freed by that point. So Washington takes control of an army that's very poorly provisioned, and also he became very aware that his army was not going to be good enough to push into Boston, and it also didn't have enough men and supplies to last beyond the winter. So he came up with an interesting idea. He had been told about all those cannons that were in Fort Ticonderoga, and he selected one of his most capable colonels, Henry Knox, to go north to Fort Ticonderoga and to capture those cannons and somehow bring them through the winter across all those lakes, all those rivers, and all those forests. So Knox goes north, and Washington gives him 1,000 pounds to get the job done. When Knox gets to Ticonderoga, he discovers these 100 cannons. Some of them are so huge that they're called Big Berthas. They weigh over 2 tons, and they shoot massive cannonballs that weigh 24 pounds. He begins escorting this artillery train south towards Boston, across partially frozen rivers, and the cannons fall in the river and they're recovered, across 3 feet of snow in places no road at all. He hires people to drag the cannon, and then in different counties, he hires different people. By January 24th, 1776, he arrives in Boston with 60 tons of cannon and only spent a little less than 600 pounds. Washington begins setting up these cannons around Boston, and General William Howe had replaced Gage as commander-in-chief of the British forces. Now, this is a pattern that we're going to see over the course of the war as well. Anytime a British officer has a major defeat, he is replaced by a different officer. Meanwhile, the American side has only one commander-in-chief the entire time, the very capable George Washington. General Howe has taken command of the British forces, and he sees that Boston not only is surrounded, but now the hills are filled with cannon. Cannon that can not only reach Boston, they can also completely reach the Boston harbor. And he realizes he has to push those cannon away now or give up Boston. So he plans an attack, and it's possible that if he would have been able to launch his attack that day, he may have won. But a terrible snowstorm causes his men to stay in Boston, and Washington continues defending those cannons. By the next day, Howe realizes it's too late. He has to abandon Boston. So he decides to set out for Nova Scotia, and on 17 March 1776, 11,000 people leave Boston on 120 ships. 9,900 soldiers, 667 women, and 553 children. They were allowed to leave without enduring a single shot by the Patriot Army. Washington let them leave. Boston is now empty, and the Patriot Army moves into Boston to take control of it. Washington turns his army towards New York, which was now vulnerable, and the British recover in Nova Scotia. Boston would become one of the major ports for activities on the high seas. My main point is this: after Lexington and Concord, and before the Declaration of Independence, the early American army was formed and had success at Boston. The British respect of American fighting caused London to hire many foreign mercenaries to supplement the British regulars.